Once a season ends, the next one begins. With expectations for nearly the first time in a decade and a half, the pressure shifts, leading the Sabres with seemingly impossible decisions. A previous regime may have gathered the pieces, but creating a roster is not the same as building a team. Buffalo's front office will have their hands full. With the draft and free agency looming in the next 5 weeks, Buffalo's front office will have their hands full. It's one thing to have the components to make an immediate run, but for those in power, shaping something special for the now and the future is an entirely different ask. Hello and welcome, I'm Ryan Lee, and welcome to Sabres Digest. All things Buffalo Sabres we hear on Sabres Digest, latest news, updates, reactions, and more. So hit subscribe down below to follow along for the entire journey, and thank you so much for joining us. So, the new season has ended, which means the next one starts pretty much the day after, right? And with that, you have your obvious talks because at the end of the day, these sports franchises are business. They have contracts to deal with, who to keep, who not to keep, and that brings up the list of unrestricted free agents coming after the season ended. There's 5 notable ones. There were maybe about a couple more along the way, but the key ones to really focus on is the man at the top, Alex Tuch. Considering the overall success he's had at the Sabres organization, what he's able to do for Buffalo since getting traded here for Jack Eichel in that trade back in 2021, it definitely has a much different feel to it because of what those moves were able to provide. It created a bit of a culture, a bit of who wants to be here. It kind of brought in those guys who have that sort of desire to be a part of the rebuild in escaping what was the drought for the Buffalo Sabres. And Alex Tuch has most certainly been the ringleader of that. And since coming over from Buffalo, he has most certainly made the most of his opportunity, putting himself in the position that we're at right now, where he's an unrestricted free agent. He has a high market value, and not just a market value, but a real asking price for what he's going to command in the market. And when you look at what he's done in Buffalo, there's every reason for it. Not just because he's from Western New York. We all know the story about how he used to cheer on the Sabres growing up, but he had a really solid 5-year run with the Sabres. Not just being a near point per game player since joining Buffalo, but also with what he's done since becoming a Sabre, having career highs in goals, assists, and points throughout the 5-year stretch that he had with the Sabres dating back to 2021. A 3-time 30-goal scorer, 3-time 65-point goal scorer, and he met both of those marks again this past season with 33 goals and 66 points in the 25-26 season. But a lot of the reason why a lot of people have soured on Alex Tuch, and I will be honest, I am part of that group, is because of what was done in the playoffs. Not against Boston, because he was a huge catalyst in the offensive production against the Bruins into pushing the Sabres into the second round. But once that moment arrived, Game 1 versus Montreal, it seemed like everything that worked against the Bruins no longer was. And you can make the argument that maybe it's a signification of the age coming, or maybe the lack of experience of trying to lead a team the way that he had versus the Sabres versus time in Vegas, where he was just part of a bigger whole. But when you have a guy like Alex Tuch and what he did with the Sabres, you're not just asking him to be a part of the roster and produce points. You're also asking him to be a true leader for these guys, especially with how young the entire roster was. And Tuch was a large part of that. It just didn't translate in the second round of the playoffs, which is, in my opinion, I think a lot of other people share the same sentiment, a large portion of the reason why Tuch maybe does not have that same desire to stick around from the Sabres fans the way he did maybe 2 months ago, for example. But at the very least, we do know what Tuch's intentions are and what he wants to do with his career. And that is to be, at the very least, in the realm of the Buffalo Sabres, even though things might not pan out that way. These were some of the quotes that he had during his locker cleanout session, because he was obviously going to be asked about his free agency status. He knows that Jarmo has expressed the desire to stay with the Buffalo Sabres, and it wasn't really a focus of his during the playoffs. He was trying to focus on the game. It did translate in round 1, but it didn't translate in round 2. And that's why I think where a lot of the disconnect has been between Tuch, maybe the front office, but at the very least between him and the fans. But at the very least, he acknowledged that he loved his time there. He wants to do whatever's best for his family, and especially with that being the main priority, not just in terms of his playing career, but also the outside of the rink stuff also between, being with family, trying to create the best living, and so on and so forth, because he didn't just become a father since being a Sabre. He also had multiple children since being a member of the Sabres organization the last 5 years. And that obviously carries a lot of weight. With all free agents, we've heard these stories throughout countless interviews and storytelling and whatever. It's not just about the money for many of these guys. It's about sending a greater message to your family, perhaps, or what you want to do in your living circumstances. Maybe something geographically that has played that role too, that we've seen free agents in the past. And some of the uncertainty and the unknown with Tuch and the Sabres comes because of the reports that we hear twice a week, 3 times a week now with 32 Thoughts, the Sportsnet podcast with Kyle Bukauskas and Elliot Friedman. And with Friedman being probably the lead NHL insider across all the networks, he really echoes a lot of the sentiments of there's really not a lot of certainty there. There's a lot of more questions than answers in this Tuch situation. Stating in the most recent podcast that he had, I believe this was on Friday, I'm filming this over the weekend, that they want to find a way to make it work. And what he was hearing is that there were still decisions to be made, especially with how Tuch and the Sabres are apart. And I've been hearing all sorts of rumblings how Alex Tuch's demand, or maybe the agent's demands, are within that double-digit million range, right? That $10+ million range, which is a really tough ask for the Sabres because projected going into this year, they're only going to have about $12 million in cap space. And the way that I see it, when you look at the contracts that are due for the Buffalo Sabres, there are bigger fish to fry that can fulfill greater needs, not just the here and now, but also down the line, with the CBA still allowing 7-year contracts, 8-year contracts before it gets shrunken down going into the next offseason. And especially when you look at the list of restricted free agents that the Sabres are going to have to deal with. We mentioned $12.9 million in cap space on the bottom line. And I do want to go over these restricted free agents at another time because I do have something planned for that down the road, just not today. But you have guys like Zach Benson and Peyton Krebs, who at the very least towards the end of the regular season and very much into the playoffs show that they really can have that fit. Maybe a cheaper alternative of guys who can fulfill that role, that two-way role that Tuch really embodies, especially with what Benson was able to do on the power play in the playoffs. He was taking the penalty kill at various points throughout the year. Peyton Krebs, he showed his value as a relative first-line player, especially after New Year's, and what his skill set does to the Sabres and how that can also help, how he's pretty much the spare man in any single role. He's a plug-and-play player you can put anywhere, both on the first line and on the fourth. It doesn't matter. He's going to find a way to get that job done. And with such little cap space available, this does leave a lot more questions than answers because even though the cap goes up, the overall demands don't change. And I do want to get into more of the Buffalo Sabres contract situation as time goes on and we have more time in the offseason to continue to talk about this. But at the very least, what we know is that there is one lingering question and a very expensive one when it comes to Alex Tuch standing within the Buffalo Sabres. He was easily one of the best offensive producing forwards, and he does do a lot of good on the defensive side as well. If I'm not mistaken, he got Selke consideration over the last several years when he was with the Sabres. But is that enough? That is the big question. And Jarmo Kekäläinen and Lindy Ruff, they're going to have a lot of questions on their hands that they have to answer in the coming weeks, with the draft coming up in June and free agency coming up on July 1st. The way that I see it and the way that maybe a lot of other Sabres fans view it as well, Tuch is a guy that maybe you let walk because you can take that $10 million worth of cap or however much extra on top of that and spread it out to multiple players, or maybe have bigger fish to fry in terms of young players coming up down the pipeline, how we saw so many of those key young pieces come to Buffalo from Rochester and make that immediate impact. Think of your Ostlands, your Helenuses, and even what Zach Benson was able to do, like we mentioned in the previous slide. And also who might be coming in 2 years from now in the 2027 offseason. Obviously, a lot of questions and not a lot of answers. That's a huge part of this entire free agency off-season process that actually gets really enjoyable and a lot of fun. But the way I see it, you can fulfill that role with other players who can do a lot of similar things. And because there are so many young pieces who are ready to go off the pipeline, and how many of them can do that type of a role, it's going to be really tough for a guy like Alex Tuch to be able to keep his spot on the Buffalo Sabres. It wouldn't be ideal, but it just kind of seems like the writing at the wall at the moment. But I'm very curious to hear what any of you have to say, because I'm sure this is a very opinionated and very controversial topic within the Saberhood. But that'll do it for all of us here in Sabres Digest. Thank you so much for watching. For our latest news, updates, reactions, and more, hit subscribe down below. And also feel free to leave your comments as well. I love hearing the thoughts. I love hearing the opinions, the back and forth, especially because it is going to be a long offseason ahead of us. We are several weeks away from the draft. We are 5 weeks away from free agency, where things really get real. And sooner or later, these questions will get answered. But as of right now, Jarmo Kekäläinen is going to have his hands full. And it's one thing to build a roster, but it's a completely different thing to build a team. Especially one who looks to continue their climb beyond just being a top 5 team left standing in the NHL. Thank you so much for tuning in and following along. Thank you so much for watching. And as always, go Sabres.